in New York City this morning. He is a Wall Street Journal editorial board member. And as Mr. Stephens, good morning.
Good morning, Brian.
As we look at your paper this morning, you have a very long, as long as you can get it, editorial on 2 columns, fit and unfit to print. Did you have anything to do with this?
As a matter of editorial policy, we don't disclose who has what to do with which editorials, except if prizes are involved. So I can't really answer that question.
Well, how about this question then? Assuming that you know something about it, can you explain to us why this editorial is here and what it means?
Well, look, it's the product of obviously a considerable amount of effort, thought, deliberation. It concerns the New York Times' decision to disclose information about the Treasury Department's monitoring of financial transactions, international financial transactions. The story broke last week, and it prompted President Bush to call the disclosure disgraceful. The Times' executive editor, Bill Keller, defended the decision to publish in a fairly lengthy letter to readers, and this editorial takes issue with some of the points that Mr. Keller makes, and more broadly discusses responsibilities of the press vis-a-vis national secrets, wartime issues, disclosures of certain kinds of information.
In the editorial, there's some reporting that's being done here, and something that we don't normally learn from journalists. And it talks about how the story started a couple months ago and that the New York Times had been working on it. And when Tony Fratto, the Treasury's Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs, found this out, he called the Times. They then tried to talk him out of Bill Keller out of writing it. They called Bill Keller to the Treasury Department. And John Murtha got involved and asked him not to print it. The Times decided to publish anyway, as your editorial says. And then they go down and say that around the same time, Treasury contacted Journal reporter Glenn Simpson to offer him the same declassified information. Mr. Simpson has been working the terror finance beat for some time, including asking questions about the operations of SWIFT. And it is common practice in Washington for government officials to disclose a story that is going to become public anyway to more than one reporter. When did it become common practice for a department like Treasury to call other newspapers and leak a story out to them that some other newspaper has got exclusively?
Well, I can't answer that question except to say that it was certainly it certainly predates my career as a journalist. I mean, the part of the problem here, as the Journal sees it, is that Mr. Keller has invoked the Wall Street Journal to provide him with a certain amount of cover, if you will, on the decision to publish, which is to say that it wasn't just, he seems to be making the argument that it wasn't just the Times that broke the story, it was also the Wall Street Journal, the LA Times, and maybe 1 or 2 other newspapers. That's a little bit misleading in our view. It seems that the story was originally leaked to the New York Times. Treasury, we don't know who leaked it. Treasury or someone in the administration got wind of the fact that it had leaked. They repeatedly asked the Times not to publish the story, and as you mentioned, not only was it the administration that pleaded with the Times, it was Democratic Congressman John Murtha, who I'm sure you know is no friend of the administration, as well as Lee Hamilton and Governor Keene, who headed up the bipartisan 9/11 Commission. All of them felt that the information that was at stake here was sufficiently sensitive and important that it really shouldn't see the light of day. When it became clear that the Times was going to go ahead with publication, the government seems to have, according to our reporting, the government seems to have made the decision that the Times, at least they should get the story completely right. They felt, in the words of Mr. Fratto, that they had 80% of the story and 30% of it was wrong, I think words to that effect. And so they decided, A, to provide a complete and accurate picture of what the program involved, and B, to share it with other news media. So the point of this is that Mr. Keller's suggestion that somehow the journal was every bit as responsible for the disclosure, for taking advantage of an unauthorized leak is simply misleading. The journal didn't get hold of an unauthorized leak and decide to publish it. The journal got hold of the information the same way that the LA Times did, which is when the administration decided that it had no choice but to go public.
We're going to go to the phones in just a second. You were raised in Mexico City. How did that happen?
That's a long story, but my grandfather moved to Mexico in the 1930s to start a business. My grandmother was a painter who would come down to Mexico around the same time and worked with some now very well-known painters, Diego Rivera and people like that. They met. My father was born in Mexico, and there was a family business in Mexico which my father helped run when I was a child. So I spent the first 13-odd years of my life there.
Our guest was named the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post in January of 2002 at the age of 28. He's been at the Journal, as I gather, since 2004?
Well, I've been at the Journal twice. I started my career at the Journal in the 90s and worked in New York as an editor there, and then in Brussels as an editorial writer. And somewhat out of the blue, I've been doing some coverage of Israel for the Journal, and somewhat out of the blue, I was asked to throw my name in the hat for the position of editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, which I did, and not a little bit to my surprise was offered the job. I became editor in early 2002, just as the Intifada was sort of reaching a climax, and I was there for most of the sort of more severe parts of that particular conflict, although of course, as you can see from the headlines of recent days, it just rolls on and on.
Our guest is a graduate of the University of Chicago and has a master's from the London School of Economics. Our first call this morning is from Fairfield, Ohio. You're on the air, Fairfield.
Hi. I was kind of hoping that your previous guest might be listening to this too. It's kind of a carryover from your last conversation, but it has to do with media bias, press bias, and I think the editorial in the Wall Street Journal shows a very clear and major example of how some of us out here in the Midwest feel that the media is biased, and I would say even traitorous. I'll give you another one that's a little bit more intimate. I'm from Ohio. We have a young man here from Batavia, Ohio, who was captured by our enemy in 2004 and has never been seen. Recently, two privates over there in Iraq were captured and immediately murdered and butchered so bad that their bodies had to be flown to Dover Air Force, Delaware, and identified by DNA. The media is giddy with delight of the fact that now our enemy has to be given all kinds of rights, including, some would say, even civilian lawyers in civil court. Now, I'm retired, and I watch all the news stations. I subscribe to a lot of magazines and newspapers, and I have not seen one reporter, one newspaper, one media even hint about the fact that our soldiers are not given Geneva Convention rights. Those two boys who were murdered, I haven't heard anyone complain or raise the issue about their rights.
Caller, who's gotten giddy with delight that this decision was made yesterday?
The entire press corps. You could see the reporters yesterday beaming with delight on CNN and MSNBC about Bush, a crushing defeat for Bush.
Okay, thanks. Bret Stephens, what do you think?
I think that, well, your caller raises a whole number of issues. I guess the first one is the word treason. I would be very reluctant to apply that to our mainstream media as error-prone and folly-prone as it may otherwise be. And let me say this for the New York Times. We have our beef with them in our editorial page this morning, but reporters like John Burns and Dexter Filkins, I think, are really doing heroic work, bringing news about Baghdad and about what's happening in Iraq back to the United States. So I would be I would like to point that out. On the whole issue of the Hamdan decision, I've been sort of going through it slowly. It's a very long decision, about 180 odd pages. But I don't think that this is quite the landmark sweeping decision that the early media takes suggest that it is. It does not apply Geneva, it does not give enemy combatants at Guantanamo Geneva Convention protections. It does not end, it does not put an end to the prison in Guantanamo. It does not release Mr. Hamdan from prison. It's a much less sweeping decision than has been portrayed, not least because while the majority opinion was written by Justice John Paul Stevens, the opinion is a majority in large part by virtue of Justice Kennedy's concurrence, and Justice Kennedy demurred from some of Stevens's reasoning on a number of points. The President still, first of all, the decision does not invalidate the concept of military commissions. It just invalidates military commissions as they have been conceived presently. It does not, or it doesn't seem to apply Common Article 3 of the Geneva Convention to those commissions. It only seems to suggest that those commissions are a violation, currently a violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and it gives the President and the Congress an option to go back to the drawing board, rework the language of some of the enabling legislation, and potentially move forward with military commissions as before. So to your caller from Ohio, he should take a little bit of heart, I think, from this decision, which I don't think is so decisive as has been initially portrayed.
Bret Stephens of the Wall Street Journal editorial board. We go next to Sumter, South Carolina, Democrat. Good morning.
Good morning, Brian. Good to talk to you again. Don Grace from Sumter, South Carolina. My question goes to the trust issue brought up by your last guest, and I'm hoping your current guest could address it. My problem with not trusting the administration is because it seems like whenever it's good for them, they leak things out, but when it's bad for them, they scream bloody murder. And many guests brought up the example of Judith Miller. They didn't seem to criticize the time when they had Judith Miller in their pocket. And my problem with Congress addresses your first question this morning, which is the checks and balances, and with the administration's business attitude of it's easier to ask for forgiveness than it is for permission, it tends to challenge the checks and balance system to the maximum, and I believe that Congress has been letting us down. I kind of applaud the Supreme Court. Finally, someone's standing up. And I would say that this all really started with the Karl Rove strategy.
All right, sir, going to let you go. Mr. Stephens, your reaction.
Oh, obviously, I mean, it's no secret that among a big portion of the Democratic rank and file, there is this perception of a trust issue with the administration, constant accusations that it's dishonest, disingenuous, deceitful, etc. You'll recall that the Clinton administration experienced a sort of similar barrage of political abuse when it was in power for different reasons. So this is, I think, the first thing I would say is that this is as much a function of partisan perception as it is of reality. Also, on the political grounds, Democrats have been trying to ride on a strategy of calling the president dishonest, a liar, and so forth. You know, in part, the WMD issue has given a great deal of has added a great deal of fuel to that fire. Politically, it really hasn't helped the Democrats very much, just as it didn't help the Republicans in 1998 when they actually suffered reversals on the eve of President Clinton's impeachment. So I suppose the first thing I would say is I'd caution partisans of either stripe to indulge that kind of rhetoric. I don't think the Bush administration has been, in any serious sense, dishonest with the public. Of course, they try to spin the news their way. Every administration does that. Every politician does that. there is a difference between spin and dishonesty.